Now I'd like to welcome to the show Patrick Hedger, Executive Director of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance and a distinguished Competitive Enterprise Institute alumnus. Welcome to the show, Pat.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's good to be home, so to speak.
All right. So you're an expert on all this stuff that has to do with the Federal Trade Commission. And first of all, let me just say thank you for your service. Better unions than me. It's really you and CEI's own Jessica Malujan that are doing the job that none of us want to do, much like immigrants to this country. Uh, so start off, give us the sort of like mini lesson on what we've seen for people who have had, more engaging things to do for the past few years. What's the big change that the FTC has gone through in the past few years? Because my intuition is that things have gone a little wild.
Yeah, I'll try to give you the 50,000 foot view. So traditionally, I mean, really since probably about the 1970s, the main antitrust enforcement agencies, the FTC being one of them, have pursued an agenda based in the consumer welfare standard. And the consumer welfare standard is very self-explanatory, right? They're going to pursue antitrust enforcement actions when there are potential actions by competitors in the marketplace that ultimately harm consumers, usually through higher prices, lower quality, things like that. But now we have seen a shift in a radical kind of new theory of an approach to antitrust that has taken hold of the FTC essentially because it's one of its main proponents is now chair of the FTC, Lena Khan, that looks at not just consumer harm but also competitive harm, right? So not just the consumer welfare standard, but almost a competitor welfare standard as well. And while I sort of understand the underlying logic there, this is getting into a bit of picking winners and losers, right? You open the door to a lot of cronyism, corporate welfare, and things like that when you start to look after competitors and start going after specific business practices instead of looking at the welfare of the consumer base, right? Ultimately, it's not about whether or not a business succeeds or fails in the face of competition. It's about, is the consumer benefiting from lower prices and more innovation? And so we're really just concerned seeing the FTC kind of abandon what has worked and produced really the most innovative economy in the world over the better part of the last half century in pursuit of a really novel and kind of backward approach to antitrust as we know it.
Well, yeah, because it seems like if we're no longer worrying about primarily about consumers getting hurt or having to deal with worse products, what sort of is there a real standard at all, right? Or is it a non-standard vibes based management philosophy where you just sort of go after whatever company you kind of feel like you don't like that week or that month? It also seems like at a certain point, if you are really successful, you get a lot of customers and you get a lot of market share, which is what you're supposed to do when you're building a company. At some arbitrary point, someone decides, oh wait, nope, you've been too successful. No, you've made too much money. You're serving too many consumers. You've got too much market share. And so the more successful you are, the more you get regulated and penalized and broken up and sent down to the minor leagues. I mean, it's kind of like the English Premier League in reverse. The more successful you are, then you automatically get penalized for it.
Yeah, so I maybe this is a cliche phrase, but it's almost like participation trophy economics coming into play at the FTC, right? Where instead of looking at how the consumer is doing and whether or not a business is big or small doesn't really matter, right? You've got sort of like the real, like the explicit problems, and then there are sort of some of the future potential problems with this approach, right? So the first sort of explicit problem is when you have sort of this participation trophy approach to competition policy, where everybody needs to get a fair shot and nobody can ever really win. That means the consumers can never really win. You're talking about effectively subsidizing businesses that aren't as innovative and don't serve consumers as well for the name of nominal competition, right? As if it's better to have 5 terrible competitors versus 2 really good ones. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you in the end case for the user. And then there's the problem of sort of unshackling antitrust from an objective standard, right? Which is the consumer welfare standard, right? You can look at prices, you can look at innovation, say that things are objectively getting better or worse. But what they're trying now at the FTC, I think, opens the door to a lot of abuse of antitrust going forward because the underlying antitrust statutes are actually very vague. And so that I see a potential where you could have a future administration that is holding up mergers and acquisitions and other business practices because they've got a political beef with the company. And because a lot of these agencies, the DOJ and the FTC, are run by political appointees, I see a lot of room for abuse if you move away from sort of an objective standard of competition to this subjective. We'll do anything that we can to prop up this person over here or this person over there.
Yeah, if there are plenty of cases where, and we see this in, the infrastructure spending bill or in renewable energy or all sorts of things where the federal government is, investing or giving subsidies and encouragement to particular firms. Well, if the policymakers are already publicly invested and they've already shown up at a press conference talking about how great this company is, well, that might lead to some favoritism down the road in favor of that company that has already gotten a government endorsement. Like no one was going to break up Solyndra. As it turns out, it didn't matter, because they went out of business. But when you already have that endorsement and political figures are already invested in the success of a specific company, well, that obviously puts, at the very least, it puts a federal regulator in a difficult position, if not a potentially corrupt position.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look at a real tangible example right now is that you see a lot of conservative politicians are upset with, looks like there's a contract dispute that's going on between the Newsmax news agency and DirecTV, which is a television provider that is majority owned by AT&T at this point. And you're seeing a lot of politicians, the former president, President Trump included, saying, hey, you're censoring them. This is a political decision, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to get into the specifics. I don't really know. From everything I've seen, it's a contract dispute. But even if there were some political decisions there, I could see a world where a future Trump administration potentially, with an unmoored antitrust standard, unmoored from consumer welfare, starts looking disfavorably at other mergers and acquisitions and business practices of AT&T that are completely unrelated to whatever's going on with DirecTV and Newsmax, right? It's all about the ability to create leverage to achieve political ends. And I don't want to see that happen. I don't want to see that happen to any company. I want to see companies rise and fall on their own merits, not whether or not they're on the president woke up on the right side of the bed one day. I think it's a huge existential risk to the economy to have that level of uncertainty that important business transactions and practices can be halted because you maybe donated to the wrong candidate or any other consideration. I mean, I think it sends a really chilling effect through the entire economy.
A chilling warning for all of us. So when it comes to sort of industry by industry, there's some interesting examples here. One that has people at CEI have written about and used to be a sort of like long ago historic example that we trotted out on occasion has been in, as they say, in the discourse in social media and among Washington, D.C. people. That is deregulation of the airline industry. So airlines used to be very heavily regulated by the Civil Aeronautics Board, among other agencies. And then around 1978, that old peanut farmer from Georgia presided over a big loosening up. And so a lot of companies had more freedom to determine their routes and pricing and things. And as I'm sure you know, average prices for consumers went down significantly after that happened. So airline tickets have become a lot cheaper in real dollar terms. But now we have some people saying, gosh, maybe we should bring all those rules back. We need to like re-regulate the airlines. And what did deregulation really give us anyway? After all, there's no more prime rib and spiral staircases on wide body jets anymore. Haven't things gotten terrible?
Yeah, it's really funny to see lots of progressive groups out there, clamoring for inherent inefficiencies, right? I mean, everything about an airline is weight and how many people you can get to a certain destination, right? And it's all about weight and efficiency, and to see progressive groups clamoring for unnecessary weight on aircraft, right? Prime ribs and spiral staircases. It's just crazy. I don't think people really understand what they're asking for. You've got a lot of young activists that only see pictures of advertisements of airlines back in the day, not realizing what the situation actually was, which was it was prohibitively expensive. I mean, it was a true luxury to be able to travel by air. You're seeing, these photos and pictures of, people getting the prime rib and the spiral staircases. That's because airlines couldn't compete on price. They had to compete on some of these luxury features. But now they're able to compete on price, which means we've really democratized air travel. And now you, instead of having to show up in a suit or tuxedo or whatever for your flight and enjoy your prime rib, you show up in sweatpants and be at your destination for a fraction of the cost. And they're much safer now too. They're competing on safety. They're competing on price. They're competing on the number of routes that they offer. And all of those things at the end of the day are probably a lot more important to the average consumer. And if you want to pay more for those luxury features, you're still welcome to do that. But I just don't think there's anything very progressive about going back to the days of when airlines didn't compete on price. They crashed a lot, and really they were only competing for upper class customers. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Again, it's this sort of false nostalgia for the good old days that never truly existed.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at, like you said, their image is from like a magazine ad from like Life magazine in 1960 of a sort of idealized first class flight, and they imagine, oh well, if the rules were different, then that's what I would have. That's what my flight would be. Is this very fancy flight with tons of leg room, and then there's a stewardess with carving you fresh roasted turkey or something. Well, for most people, for most of us, the picture would not include you, right? Because you wouldn't be able to afford it. You would have like the vice president of IBM would be traveling on a company expense account, and that's what would be getting paid for. You would be at home, or you would be sitting with your bicycle. And that it's sort of a this theme we like to talk about, the seen and the unseen, kind of understanding the non-obvious implications of economic policies. The You have that sort of like romanticized image, but the non-obvious reality is that most people would actually be excluded from that. So as most people were in fact excluded from it in in the 1950s and 60s when airline travel was so much more expensive. But that is one of those things that I think we always try and keep in mind, at CEI, on, Free the Economy, is don't assume that there will be the ideal result for every one of these policies. You don't get to pick how things will turn out. You have to actually think through what's the most likely result of all of these things, not what did a politician promise you would be the best, shiniest results.
Right. And a lot of look, air travel, I'm sure nobody really looks forward to getting on a flight these days. I get it. And I think that a lot of those problems are just sort of inherent in the fact that you're getting in a metal tube that's, flying through the sky at 500 miles an hour, right? There are some limitations to what can be achieved with that. But ultimately, I think we could increase competition among airlines in the United States, but the problem is that you still have government in the way that's blocking a lot of that competition, right? I think deregulation was a good first huge step, but we still haven't taken that second step because most people aren't aware that you can't take a Lufthansa or Air France or whatever flight from New York to LA. You have to be on an American carrier, majority owned by Americans. For a while, Virgin America operated in the United States, owned in part by Sir Richard Branson, famous British billionaire, famous Virgin America or Virgin Atlantic and all of his other Virgin brand companies. But Virgin America is no longer operating in the United States because it was acquired by Alaska Airlines. And Richard Branson couldn't do anything to stop that acquisition because he was not allowed under U.S. law to own a majority of Virgin America. And so you have these air cabotage laws in the United States that prevent foreign majority owned and operated airlines from operating between two domestic ports. And so that's an inherent limiter on competition that you don't really see in the European air markets or Southeast Asian air markets, where you have a lot of countries that are very close together, and most of the air routes are actually therefore international routes, and you get greater competition, better services, and you get a lot more low fare carriers as well than we have in the United States. So there's an easy thing that we could do if we really wanted to have more competition in the United States. And then you've got all of the various restrictions that are related to the FAA, that are related to the fact that airports are owned by local governments for the most part, and those gate assignments are given out in terms of all sorts of different political considerations and economic considerations made by local governments. So this idea that capitalism once again has failed. I mean, the most important thing an airline does where it lands is owned and operated by the government. So let's pump the brakes on the fact that on the talk of capitalism and deregulation has failed the airlines. We've only really, I think, scratched the surface in terms of being able to deregulate that industry.
See, that's the energy I like to see. Another topic that we can rip from the headlines here, Law and Order style, is the Senate Judiciary Committee antitrust hearing that you were just tweeting about. So we have Senator Amy Klobuchar, high-profile antitrust policymaker, was talking about, and plenty of other antitrust critics have made the same point, talking about that there are other countries supposedly that have shown us so much leadership on competition policy, and we should really be looking to them, in their leadership and copying their style, paying attention to them. But the countries she and plenty of other antitrust critics cite tend to have either terrible economic performance, terrible actual competition policy, or both. Should we be just ignoring the EU and South Korea, or should we be doing the opposite as them?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we want to do things that shield our companies from the onerous regulations that are kind of bleeding in, right? And most people that have been on the internet over the last 5 years have seen all of these like, hey, we collect cookies pop-ups now. That's because of a European regulation called the General Data Privacy Regulation, or GDPR. And so you can see, because it's the World Wide Web, that regulations in one place may impact consumers in another. So we need to be making sure that we're putting in place standards that promote innovation and can shield American companies and American consumers, most importantly, from some of these regulations that kind of bleed in from overseas. But yeah, to your point, when we're talking about leadership in terms of regulation, we ought to look at what the product is of that. And frankly, the European Union, which is an economic union that has double the population of the United States and a GDP that's comparable of advanced developed countries, doesn't produce any major leaders in the tech sector. I mean, I think the largest tech company by market cap in the European Union is Spotify, and it's like number 20 something. All the rest of the companies are either based in the United States or in China. So what we're really in is a competition for the future of the next billion people in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and rural America and other places that are going to come online. Are they going to come online to an internet that is predominantly influenced by and created and built by American companies, or by Chinese companies? That's the choice that we have right now. This idea that the EU or any governments like the European Union that have a lot of precautionary principle instincts are somehow global leaders in tech is just not the case. I mean, they're leaders in creating regulatory headaches for tech companies, but what we're really seeing is a lot of jealousy and protectionism, quite frankly, from governments that don't have the kind of innovative sector like Silicon Valley.
Well, yeah, I mean, this reminds me of an event, which I tell the story all the time, but there was an event on antitrust a few years ago here in Washington, D.C., and they had a panel. This was actually an event that was promoting more aggressive antitrust policy, but they had a panel of people from the UK and Europe, asked them about what's the experience over there. So they asked a woman who was from, I think she was Scandinavian originally, but she was a regulatory lawyer in the UK, and someone raised their hand and they said, well, this is an interesting proposal that we be more aggressive about, regulating, say, big tech companies, for example. But isn't it an issue that in Europe, and I think this was when the UK was actually still part of the EU, isn't it an issue that Europe doesn't really have any big tech companies? And isn't that kind of a problem? And she said she was completely untroubled by this question and said, oh, no, you don't understand. The companies that we would regulate more, like Google and Meta, they're bad companies. And so it's good that we don't have any of them there. So it's a proof of concept for European antitrust regulators that they don't have any big tech companies. because all of the existing big tech companies, according to them, are bad and shouldn't exist in the first place. So having none means success by their definition.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that going on in the American policy debates as well. Just the thing is a lot of people are afraid to say that quiet part out loud. I fundamentally believe that a number of folks I disagree with on tech policy are effectively afraid to say that we ought to get rid of Google, we ought to get rid of Amazon. These companies should never exist because by and large, these companies are immensely popular with American consumers. People like the fact that they can get basically anything they want delivered to their door effectively the next day. That's a pretty good service, and for the most part, the prices are falling in those for those services as well. Americans like the tech companies that we've built up here, and they like being global leaders on these things. And you've got a lot of that kind of mentality that's sort of hiding in the weeds on these issues, right? Whether it's antitrust or not to bring it up, but Section 230 is sort of another side of the coin of this entire debate, where folks are attacking these various statutes, and they're trying to tell you that, oh well, Google or Facebook or Amazon, the Silicon Valley would be fine, they can deal with it. But in reality, there's nothing more they'd love to see than for a lot of these companies to fall apart, because they fundamentally believe in big is bad. But big is bad is such a ridiculous idea, and it's particularly ridiculous when we're talking about, again, internet companies, right? Because you have this idea of network effects, right? Where the larger the network is, the greater value it is to the consumer, right? Talking about airlines again, right? An airline's more valuable to somebody if you can take it to more places. And in internet companies that can't take you to a lot of places or do a lot of things for you, connect you to a lot of the things that you want to see or buy, are inherently less valuable. So this idea of big is bad just does not apply to the internet. But there's just, I guess there's some sort of intrinsic bias with a lot of people that they're just scared of big companies. They dislike big companies, and I'll never understand that. But that I think they could be a lot more forthcoming, like your example, and what their true aims are.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that people would really enjoy using a social media platform that only posts to IP addresses within 50 miles of their home, right? If you
Right.
could post all you want,
Exactly.
but only people who live within 50 miles of you will ever see any of your updates. So, I mean, I think a lot of people are temperamentally suspicious of what they consider to be really big institutions in general, because they feel kind of powerless next to anything that's big. I would say they should be more worried about the U.S. federal government than an individual private company. But uh, I think people have a certain sort of cultural unease about institutions they think are too big. But I also think they're not really thinking through the implications of what would actually happen if the policies that they are in favor of were actually implemented. Um, and I'm really glad that you mentioned Section 230, because that is just exactly what I was going to ask you about next. Uh, it has been an especially contentious area, the question of social media content moderation, and whether, for example, Twitter is allowed to ban people who post pictures of Nazi frogs. Um, During the Trump years, a lot of people assumed that Twitter was sort of vaguely left-wing. Some people thought it was extremely left-wing, but that was sort of the general consensus among a lot of people, including left-wing people who liked the fact that it was vaguely left-wing.
Right.
But And so a lot of conservatives talked about, and we know a lot of these guys. They wanted more regulations on platform managers that said you can't ban people. You have to use a First Amendment standard. If anything's legal, then you have to leave it up on the platform. But now that Elon Musk has taken over Twitter and he's retweeting Jordan Peterson, people are less worried that Twitter is anti-conservative now, for obvious reasons. So what is the state of play on this? Are there people out there who are still angry about Section 230 and they want rules that saying you can't take people down, or has that kind of like simmered out now that everyone has changed positions on what Twitter is supposed to be like?
Yeah, no, I think that gets to the point I was kind of making previously, where I think a lot of the attacks on Section 230, they're very thinly veiled about trying to deal with one problem or the other. But in reality, they're just trying to. I see a lot of sort of table flipping, so to speak, right, where people acknowledge that Section 230 is what is responsible for the huge platforms that we have now and the huge reach of the folks that are able to leverage those platforms. And I think that because they see evidence of progressive bias at a lot of these large tech companies, there is a push to just gut Section 230, not to enhance your own speech or right of center speech or whatever, but to basically say, if I can't do as well on these online platforms, nobody should be able to. And that's where I sort of think the state of play is right now on Section 230. Nobody will admit that, but it's just some of the attacks on the law are so ideologically incoherent that you basically see a lot of critics of big tech sort of throwing anything they can against the wall against Section 230, even completely contradictory goals, just because they want to see the law weakened in any way possible in order to try and weaken the companies that benefit from it. And so that's where I think the state of play is now. And for folks that may or I'm jealous if this is the first time you're hearing of Section 230. Just a brief reminder that this is a law that was passed in the mid 90s, that it says a very simple thing: you are responsible for what you say online, not necessarily where you say it or who shares it. That's basically it. It's a very simple law, and it's being misrepresented, often purposefully, again, to try and achieve sort of those ends that I was talking about, and trying to kind of eat away at the dominant web platforms.
And don't we believe in personal responsibility anymore? I mean, aren't you supposed to be responsible for the things you say online? This the future of where we go from here, I think is interesting. That the Section 230 debate is more about kind of ideological advantage and trying to get a leg up on the competition, whether that's Democrats versus Republicans or conservatives versus liberals or whatnot, and that we should be able to say, well, it's just an open market of ideas and everyone can have their can go wild, and if your side is more successful, it gets more likes or retweets or whatever, then then I guess you win the internet. But where it is a problem, and I think a lot, some of the people we disagree with about Section 230 have sort of a point here. If there is active government collusion, then all those other arguments are off the table. So if federal government officials, people in the White House, people in cabinet departments, law enforcement agencies are going to a social media company and saying, oh, hey, we saw this stuff we don't like. Can you take that down? Because we, the government officials, don't like it. We've decided it's misinformation. We've decided it's bad for public health. That, I think, and there obviously, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about that recently, both having to do with supposed electoral misinformation, but also COVID stuff, and that I do take very seriously. I think some of our conservatives friends have said, you libertarian types, you just want the big tech companies to do whatever they want. You don't care that liberals are pushing us out of the the public discourse and online debates. I think if it's equal between your people on the internet, my people on the internet, that's fine. But if it's government putting their thumb on the scale or on the delete button, then that's a completely different discussion. But the implication for that, I think, and I'm happy to hear what you have to say about that, is that the solution is to limit government's ability and to limit the discretion of government policymakers to press the delete button, not to tell companies they can't manage their own platforms.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. There's a few distinctions here, right? A couple of bright lines, right? Prior to the evidence coming out of the explicit government pressure on tech companies to censor speech, right? If a tech company is too liberal, that's their right, that's their platform, right? And it's simply agreeing with the government on what is or what is not misinformation is not a First Amendment problem, right? You're free to agree or disagree with the government as much as you like, and you're free to manage your private property as much as you like. But when we have this explicit evidence of companies being pressured, even nudged by government officials, that crosses a red line for me. And it also gets back to kind of what we're talking about with antitrust, where I get concerned, even if the government doesn't demand speech decisions be made one way or another, if they nudge a company, that company still has in the back of their mind that, hey, I'm regulated by X, Y, and Z other agencies that are all still controlled by this same White House. I better maybe try and scratch their back here and only promote the information they want me to promote, right? All of that stuff becomes really problematic, even if it's not like a explicit First Amendment violation de jure, right? It really crosses that line for me in terms of the spirit of the First Amendment, right? The government shouldn't be playing a role in deciding in any way what gets left up on these platforms if the content, of course, is legal speech. So what I get concerned with is that folks are now taking this evidence, right, the Twitter files or whatever, and still using that to go after Section 230 and go after and try and turn a lot of these companies into common carriers, or put new restrictions in place on the private sector to try and prevent the abuse we saw in government. Now, I want folks to think about the precedent that sets. The issue we have right now is that the government is not respecting free speech and is leaning on private companies. So your answer to that is to further curb free speech rights. That is giving the government exactly what it's asking for. It sets a terrible precedent, right? You are giving a bad dog a treat. Don't do that, right? If we're going to do anything here, it's exactly as you said. We should be limiting the ability of government officials to be in touch with these companies and to pressure these companies, not limiting the private freedoms that apply to all the rest of us.
And yeah, I think this applies to lots of regulation, the kind of stuff that, people at CEI talk about, other people around town, that there's no such thing as a voluntary suggestion from the federal government, right? This is that anything that comes with that seal, that letterhead at the top, if it comes from certainly obviously the president, but even any of these, hundreds of, deputy assistants, somebody's that work for the federal government, there is an implied threat behind anything that comes from one of those government agencies to a private company that says, oh, well, maybe you might want to think about this. Like, okay, well, I want to think about staying out of jail, so yeah, maybe I will think about that. And so when
we've all
you have
seen
government
crime
officials,
day, right?
yeah,
We've all seen crime a day, right? Every one of us has commit a felony without even knowing it at some point, I'm sure, right? And that even applies even more so to a business, right? You got 200,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. If they want to find something, they will. And that's really the scary implicit threat behind exactly what you're talking about.
yeah, I mean, my felonies I commit on purpose. I don't leave them to chance. But and because of that, and we recognize that, the sort of the power differential concept in all sorts of ways, right? Like it's unethical for a boss to, hit on their employee, right? Because there's a power differential there, right? You can't just say no, because then your boss might retaliate or be mad at you or not promote you. Like if we understand different ethical standards based on power differentials in something as sort of common and everyday of that, surely we have to realize that there's no such thing as a soft nudge from the federal government that can tax you into oblivion, that can put you in jail, that can like investigate you for years. So this is what I think when you have people who are sort of defending some of this, saying like, well, shouldn't we want the government to stand up against misinformation? Why, I hope the government will stop this, vaccine disinformation from being disseminated. It's not a suggestion, right? It's not your friendly neighborhood doctor giving you advice on public health. It is a breathtakingly large, dangerous, and violent behemoth breathing down your throat. And so for that reason, I think we need, the strictest possible limits on federal officials making those helpful suggestions, especially when free speech rights are implicated.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And what's also a big problem is sort of the inherent subjectivity in terms of a lot of the misinformation that folks are trying to tackle, right? It's one thing to say whether or not it's a good idea to drink bleach, right? It is an objectively bad idea to drink bleach. Okay. We can have that conversation separately, but when we're talking about political misinformation, right? A lot of that stuff's in the eye of the beholder. My favorite example to use is a lot of the criticism of the Obama administration was, oh, you know what? They raised the deficit. They did a lot of deficit spending. And so if you had a political ad that said Barack Obama raised the deficit, right? There's some truths there, there's some falsehoods there, right? He was president over some, presided over and signed into law some budgets that had huge deficits. Deficits came down during his administration, but they never went away. But his own budgets that never got enacted into law, he would have raised deficits if he had the power. But of course, the president doesn't have the power over the purse. That's Congress. So there's a lot of like half truths, whole lies, entire falsehoods that are all contained within the statement that President Obama raised the deficit. That is that misinformation or not? It's really kind of where you sit in terms of on the time scale and on the political scale. So trying to regulate those things in any way, right? If a tech company wants to do it, they're free to pursue that fool's errand. I don't think it's a great idea, but they're free to do it. But for the federal government to be coming in and start talking about misinformation on inherently subjective questions, particularly in politics, right? I voted for the Affordable Care Act. That means I lowered healthcare costs. Did I really? Do I actually support affordable care? Because healthcare has gotten more expensive, right? So there's all these, gray lines in politics that trying to regulate misinformation on these, political sound bites is, including probably a lot of the things we've said on this podcast, is basically impossible. So it's really problematic when you've got the federal government who has an inherent interest in one way or the other coming in and trying to regulate that.
I think it's really true what my old friend Obi-Wan Kenobi once said, which is, you'll find that many of the truths we cling to in this life depend greatly on one's point of view. And I think that's true in this area as well.
That's right.
Pat, this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for being with us. Tell me, tell listeners before we go, where can they find you and all your awesome stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. We are at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. That is protectingtaxpayers.org. You can find me at Pat Hedger 18 on Twitter and at Protect Taxpayers on Twitter as well. That's the best place to usually find our updates. But again, protectingtaxpayers.org.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, Pat, and I'm sure we will have you on again soon.
Thanks for having me.